Few things are sadder than seeing a loved one slip gradually into dementia. This is what happened to my grandmother, my mom's mom. She got to the point where she couldn't live on her own anymore, but she didn't really have other debilitating health issues. So she didn't need to be in a hospital or a nursing home. She just needed someone around to help her with daily living, because she would forget things. So my parents converted their garage into a small apartment so she could live there. And she loved this. At the time, our two kids were young, maybe 6 and 8, and we'd go over and visit pretty often. We'd be in the main part of the house, and Grandma would ask, "Hey, have you seen my new apartment? Come on, I'll give you the tour." So we would all go over and she'd show us all around. This is my bed and this is my chair where I like to sit and read, all the stuff. And then we'd all come back to the main house. And then maybe 5 minutes later, Grandma would look up like she just thought of something and ask, "Have you all seen my new apartment? Come on, let me show you." And we'd just go and take another tour of the apartment. Our kids understood the basics of what was happening, and they just thought it was hilarious. We all just played along each time, because that's what made Grandma happy. But it was also sad to see her gradual decline. My guest today, Kari, could tell that her dad was slipping into dementia, and she wanted to help. But she never expected to see him decline so rapidly. And there was really nothing she could do, because it happened on a 1,700-mile road trip. Real people in unreal situations.
The eerie silence when I walked in, and he's just staring at me.
I was like, "Hello, like, are you okay?" And then I had to tell him it was me.
There was just blood everywhere.
They're shouting, they're screaming, they're being hit by bullets, they're hitting the ground.
And in that moment, I literally thought, this is how I die.
Everything changed then.
And I just thought to myself, this isn't happening.
Every single story deserves to be heard.
I'm Scott Johnson, and this is What Was That Like? Growing up, Kari was always a daddy's girl.
I was always very close with my dad when we were young. He was a good dad. I remember when I was little, I would sit on his lap and at dinner or before dinner and in his reclining chair and cuddle with him. And he always made a point of doing things with me, even though I was a girl. Like, I have an older brother and they would go fishing a lot, but my dad would take me with them sometimes and stuff. But every time my dad saw me, he always did like a little fake pinch on my cheek and he would get a big smile on his face.
Kari's dad was from Newfoundland originally, but their family made their home for many years in Acton, Ontario, before he retired.
Met my mom. She is from the same town and raised me and my brother here. And decided to move back to Newfoundland in 2007 because it was my dad's dream to retire and go back to his hometown. They moved there, actually. They sold their house, packed up, and bought a house in Port Limington in 2007.
So they're enjoying retirement and would come back to Ontario to visit sometimes. But there was one visit in 2013 when Kari noticed some changes in her dad.
First sign was we have a gas stove, and my dad had a small plate of like leftovers. I think it was like Boxing Day or something. In his mind, I think he wanted to warm it up in the microwave. I think that's what his intention was. But for some reason, he took this plate and put it on our gas stove and turned the burner on. So I'm looking at him and I'm like, well, that's weird. And, kind of panic mode. I was like, no, Dad, I don't, it goes in the microwave. And he would get all frustrated really easily. Another thing is boiled eggs. He forgot how to boil eggs. And he loved boiled eggs. He probably boiled 1 million eggs in his lifetime. And he completely forgot how to boil an egg. He said to me, he says, how do I boil an egg? It was like a little thing, but I wasn't living with him. So I didn't see this on a daily basis. But because there was so long of a gap in between seeing him, I would notice these things were like big differences in things he would forget.
Kari and her husband, David, would also go and visit her parents most years. But then there was a gap when they couldn't make that trip, and the decline was more noticeable.
We went in 2019, and then COVID hit in 2020. We couldn't go at all in 2020. So me and my husband went in the summer of 2021. We took them on a road trip for a few days, and we stayed in cabins, and he was still somewhat with it then. He could still say words properly. His sentences weren't the best, but you could still somewhat have kind of a conversation with him, but he wouldn't say anybody's names anymore. He knew who we were, but he couldn't say anybody's names. That was like a blank to him. Because I hadn't seen him in 2 years, I noticed a big difference.
One of Kari's biggest concerns was if her dad would ever need urgent medical care, there was nothing close by.
Where they lived, it was such a small town that to go anywhere, they would have to drive to Botwood, which would be a 20-minute drive. And that's just a tiny hospital. Or to go to Grand Falls would be a 45-minute drive. Gander was an hour and a half. But everything was far away. And it's not like here or the U.S. where we have towns with all these side roads and back roads, and there's one road in, one road out to pretty much every town in Newfoundland. And it's just forest, ocean, and rock in between. There's like no little towns in between. There's no homes on the side of the road. There's nothing.
Kari's mom was the full-time caregiver, but it was becoming too much for her.
I could see my mom was struggling with my dad. He wouldn't take his medication anymore, so we used to have to grind it up and put it in chocolate pudding for him. It was the only way he would eat it without knowing about it. He was starting to get up in the middle of the night, like 15, 20 times. He would just get up and turn the sink on and not do anything. And he was just up and down constantly all night long. And my mom was clearly getting frustrated. She had her own health issues over the years. She wasn't in the best of health to be able to take care of my dad.
So Kari and Dave decided that a change was needed.
Basically, me and my husband came up with a plan, my husband Dave, to come up with a plan for, we were going to say, come back to our house. We'll build you an apartment in our basement, and you and Dad can live there, where we can all help you take care of Dad, and you're not on your own.
It still took a bit of convincing to get her mom to agree to leave Newfoundland.
As frustrated as she was, it was a bit of a tough sell because she loved her house. They owned it outright. They had a beautiful plot of land in Newfoundland, like high up on the hill. You could see the bay out from the distance, and it was just beautiful. It was just forest, and it was nice. I mean, it was a nice house with a beautiful property, and it was like her dream home, her whole life type of thing. So it took a lot of convincing to get her to come back with us.
But her mom did agree that it was best. So the house was sold, and the plan was for Kari to fly back in September. Dave couldn't go with her because he had to work. So Kari would spend 3 weeks getting everything either packed up or sold, and then drive them back to Ontario. This was a big project.
It was after much trepidation with my mother, of her trying to get rid of stuff. I'm like, keep or get rid of. Quick response, keep or get rid of. Because they were moving from a 3-bedroom home to a 1-bedroom apartment, essentially. So they had to significantly downsize a lot of their stuff.
Kari's dad, at this point, didn't really understand what was going on, but he didn't like it.
He was not happy. He just knew there was a lot of kind of commotion going on in the house. Things were changing. Everything was different. My dad had become very much of a routine person. Everything had to be familiar to him. And so once things were being moved around and in boxes, and a lot of people were coming in and out, he was very agitated and mad. That stuff was going out the door and not coming back type thing. He didn't understand what was going on at all.
But he had his cat.
His beloved cat, Kirby. Oh, he loved that cat. Yes, that was his pride and joy, Kirby. Kirby the cat was the size of a dog. He was a big cat. Big orange and white cat. Yeah.
So everything is done, and they're ready to embark on this trip to Acton, Ontario. Kari will be in the driver's seat, her mom in the passenger seat, and her dad in the back seat with Kirby. And this is a long trip. It's around 1,700 miles, or about 2,800 kilometers. That's about the distance from Chicago to Los Angeles. And before we talk about what happened on this trip, you need to understand it's divided into 6 different segments or legs. So I'll kind of summarize what those are, and the trip can begin. First, you leave in the house. You've got a 3-hour drive to Corner Brook, Newfoundland.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that. That was a visit. And then another 2-hour drive to Port aux Basques. That's where the car ferry is.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got the 6-hour ferry ride over to Nova Scotia. And then from there, you've got a 2-hour drive where you're going to stay overnight. The next day, a 10.5-hour drive. That's leg 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, another 8.5-hour drive to get to your house.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm exhausted just thinking about all of that.
Yeah.
And your mom doesn't drive either, right?
Well, she does drive, but she didn't want to drive. I said I would do all the driving just to make it easier on her, because then she could control my dad and do what she needed to kind of keep my dad settled in the back. So I said I would do all the driving. I'd always wanted to do the drive from Newfoundland to Ontario or vice versa. I did it once when I was a kid with my family. I was like 6, but I'd always wanted to do it as an adult. So I thought it would be this great trip experience.
Okay, so let's start off from their house to Corner Brook, Newfoundland. Why stop there?
We went to Corner Brook so my dad could see his sister, Mildred, for the last time. She is about 8. She was about 8 years older than my dad. But she was always very close with my dad because he was the baby of 13 children. They treated him like he was their own child, all his older sisters. So she was one of the few that was actually left in Newfoundland. So we had to make a stop there so he could see his sister Mildred. She knew it would be the last time she would see him, but he didn't understand what was going on. He just thought he was visiting his sister.
Yeah, that's kind of a bittersweet visit.
Yeah, I mean, that first leg of the drive, he was okay in the car. He wasn't too bad. He had his cat in the back seat in the carrier with him at this point, and we just told him we were going to see Mildred. So he was okay with that stretch of the drive.
And that was a 3-hour trip.
Yeah, it's about 3 hours.
Not too bad.
Not too bad. We left early in the morning, so we were there at a decent time.
So you stayed overnight at a local hotel there,
Mm-hmm.
and then the next morning you drove for a couple of hours to get to the ferry.
Mm-hmm.
So take us from there.
Yeah, so we left from Corner Brook to Port aux Basques, and I think we left 8 or 9 in the morning because you get to the ferry, and it's a big ferry. It's called Marine Atlantic, and it carries a lot of cars, but it also has like 3 decks above where you have cabins, or you can have like a chair in like an open room, and it's got restaurants and all this stuff. But this being COVID, nothing was open really still yet, and there was a lot of restrictions in place. We had to be there really early, and then you kind of get to the parking lot and you wait in line with all the other cars, and they tell you which lane to go in based off of the size of your vehicle where you're going to park on the boat.
How many cars can that ferry take?
Oh my gosh, I would easily say a couple hundred, plus transport trucks. They park a lot of the transport trucks on the top deck of the boat. They have a fleet of a few different boats. So you kind of drive into the bottom of the ship when you get on. So it's a cool experience for sure.
Yeah, it sounds interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you were going to be on this ferry for 6 hours.
As long as you have good weather, yeah, 6 to 6.5, depending.
What do you do on a car ferry for 6 hours?
Well, luckily we got a cabin. So we just got, even though it was only 6.5 hours, we thought it would be best to have a cabin because it had 2 little single beds. It had a TV, and we had our own bathroom. So if my dad was to get agitated or tired, at least he could lay down and have a nap, and we had our own bathroom, which made it a little bit better. And we could, hopefully try and keep him kind of chilled out on this experience. Because my dad loved the water, and my dad was a fisherman. He did a lot of fishing growing up. When I was a kid, he just loved fishing. But for the dementia, it made him afraid of the water.
Oh, so he wouldn't want to be out on deck looking at the water then?
No, well, I tried at one point. I did try to get him out on the deck, but he would stay kind of close to the wall. But yeah, he was kind of scared. It wasn't the clearest day. It was a little foggy and misty rain, so we didn't stay outside too long. But yeah, he was definitely afraid of the water at this point. We watched TV and he was getting agitated at one point. So I said to my mom, I'll take him for a walk around the boat. We'll just kind of kill a little bit of time. Maybe it'll take his mind off him and distract him a little bit. So we were on the 7th floor, which is where our cabin was. And we have access to floor 7, 8, and 9. You cannot go down deck to the cars once the boat has left the dock. So we were on the 7th floor. So I was walking with my dad to the elevator. And my dad was a very friendly man. He would talk to anybody and everybody, just loved to be social, even though his words didn't make any sense anymore, just would come out as gibberish. I pushed the button to the elevator and he started talking to some man behind me. And I didn't really notice that he wasn't still kind of with me. So I stepped on the elevator. And when I turned around, the doors closed and my dad was still left on the other side of the elevator. Instant panic set in because I was going up to the 9th floor. And my dad was left on the 7th floor and he had no idea what was going on, where he was, and he didn't understand anything anymore. So I am completely freaking out, panicking, like, oh my God, I lost my dad on the boat.
It feels like it's kind of the same feeling as losing a small child.
Exactly. It's the exact same feeling as losing a child. Exact same feeling, you know.
So what do you do?
I had to wait till I got to the 9th floor, and luckily the stairs were just right there too. So I got off the elevator and quickly ran down the stairs back down to the 7th floor. And well, of course, my dad was not there. I'm running around, panicked, looking for my dad. I couldn't find him anywhere. So I had to enlist a worker who I found on the 7th floor to help me find my dad. Luckily, I had a recent photo of him on my phone. So I'm like, I lost my dad. You know, he's 80 years old. He has dementia. He doesn't understand anything anymore. And I don't know where he is now. The worker went one way and I went the other way. And it took 15 to 20 minutes. And luckily, the worker found him wandering around on the 8th floor by the cabins. And it's just a maze of hallways where all the cabins are.
So he must have either gotten on another elevator or took the steps.
Yeah, apparently.
To the 8th floor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But we found him on the 8th floor wandering around. And it was like a big sigh of relief when I found him. But now I'm thinking, oh my God, now do I tell my mom I lost my dad on the boat? Do I not tell my mom I lost my dad on the boat? Before we went back to the room, we made a pit stop at the canteen area so we could grab some snacks and drinks and stuff. And I did go back and I did tell my mom I lost my dad on the boat. She was a little taken aback at first, but she kind of laughed it off. But yeah, it was scary because I'm like, what if he goes outside, you know, or it was fear. It was absolute fear.
Yeah, when his behavior is so completely unpredictable, that's the scary thing. You don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, because at this point in my dad's dementia, he'd had it for probably, I would say, 8 years. He probably had the mentality of a child at this point.
You get back to the cabin. Was he okay the rest of that ferry ride?
Nah, he was up and down. He would get bored. We tried to find something on the TV for him, right? And he would get agitated. And I would take him on more walks to kind of distract him. But I made sure I had a good eye on him the whole time.
The ferry ride takes you to Sydney, Nova Scotia. And there you had, of course, the car. You get the car off the boat. And you had a 2-hour drive. Is it still daytime?
It is just starting to get dark. It was like dusk, I would say, when the boat pulled in and we were just getting off the boat. I'm not the best night driver for vision, but neither is my mother. So I'm the better option of the two of us.
This isn't a surprise, though. I mean, you knew it was going to be starting to get dark when you drive. Okay.
Yeah. Like you can there's different schedules for the boat. This was the best schedule for us.
You had a 2-hour drive ahead of you to get to the hotel for overnight. How did that ride go?
It was not terrible. Got off the boat and we were driving from Sydney, Nova Scotia to Port Hawkesbury, Nova Scotia. So that was kind of a good distance for us because it was kind of 2 hours into Nova Scotia, which got us a little bit closer to Quebec, where if we had stayed in Sydney, Nova Scotia, it would have been like a 12-hour drive the next day. So that's kind of like why we stayed in Port Hawkesbury. Because it was getting dark, And my dad had this thing about lights, like moving quickly. I think it freaked him out and scared him a little bit. So this was literally the first night we had driven in the dark. I think the movement is and the motion and staying in different places, being in the car so much is kind of what set him off at this point.
And it's already been a long day.
It had already been a long day at this point. Yeah. So we had done pretty good with him up until this point. But this is kind of where it all went to shit in a handbasket, at this point with my dad. He was not too bad on the drive, but once we got to the hotel, he was starting to get really confused about what was going on. I don't even remember if we stopped for dinner that night. I remember getting to the hotel and trying to get to bed at a decent time because we had to get up very early the next morning for our long leg to Quebec. So we did our magic pudding mix for my dad with his medication in it.
And was the medication partially designed to help him sleep?
Yes. So he was it was a sleep aid, like a prescribed one, which is it's a sleeping aid plus it helps with mental disorders and stuff, So there's no real good medication for dementia. I think he had behavioral issues. So I think this kind of kept it in check a little bit, but he wouldn't sleep otherwise. So he had to take the pill, but the only way was for us to crush it and put it in his pudding. But we had to dilute it too. Otherwise, if he felt the granules in there, he wouldn't eat it. So he was smart that way. He was very picky.
You gotta outsmart him. Yeah.
Yeah. We tried a few different things, right, to outsmart him.
So did he sleep overnight that night?
He did after a while. He was doing weird things that night. He had gone into the bathroom and for whatever reason, I don't know why, but he peed in the garbage can instead of the toilet. And this is where his confusion really started to show. And he would just not settle. Like he was laying on the bed and he kept reaching for the cat. I don't know if he was trying to pet the cat or what he was trying to do, but his hands were just kind of going at the side of the bed almost all night long. Like he would not settle down.
Which means you couldn't sleep either.
Which means I couldn't sleep because, I'm filming my dad, right? At the same time with little things that he's doing to show Dave when I got home and also for doctors and stuff so they could see what was going on. We managed to get some sleep that night, not very much, but we got some. But we had to get up at 5:30 the next morning to head for Quebec.
And this was leg 5, so this was a 10.5-hour drive.
Yeah, this stretch was 1,093 kilometers, so 679 miles for you guys.
And it's still just you driving.
Just me driving.
So you had a full day the day before, not much sleep that night, and now you've got over 10 hours. How did he go along that way?
It was not good at this point. We got up at 5:30. I think we left by 6 a.m. Port Hawkesbury. We were heading for Quebec City. That's where we had booked our next hotel because it was kind of like a middle point, like a good stretch between there and home. So it's funny, in Nova Scotia, we decided to take the cat out of the cat carrier because he was just meowing constantly and he just wouldn't stop meowing. So my mom, for whatever reason, decided she threw the cat carrier behind the motel down a big hill. I'm like, what? I don't understand why you just wouldn't leave it there, but she thought it was funny. So she ended up tossing it down the hill. So we didn't have the cat in a cat carrier anymore at this point either.
So you no longer have a cat carrier now?
No, we have the cat, just not in a carrier anymore. So he was roaming free around the car.
That's what I mean. She threw the carrier away.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the cat was doing okay in the car outside of the carrier. So we thought, okay, well, maybe it'll be better. He'll be quieter. Maybe it'll keep my dad settled down because he can pet him and such. We had the cat roaming loose in the car, and my dad was in the backseat on the passenger side. And we had stopped for coffees along the way, and my dad wasn't even drinking them. He just started dumping them in his lap.
Hot coffee in his lap.
Well, not hot. It wasn't hot at this point, but it had cooled down. But I don't know. He just wasn't drinking. He would just dump it in his lap. And then he would try and steal mine, or he would try and steal Mom's, But yeah, he just kept dumping it in his lap for whatever reason. I don't know why. I can't figure that part out. So his pants were soaking wet. This just kind of went on all day. And he kept trying to open the car door when we were on the highway. It was so hard to explain. Watching, you could literally see him losing his mind in the back seat. The motion and everything was just way too much for him. He couldn't handle it. He didn't recognize anything anymore. And I think that's what was wrong. He didn't recognize anything. Nothing was familiar. We were always constantly moving.
And your mom was in the front seat in the passenger side, right?
She was.
So he's back there kind of by himself. How do you have any kind of control over that? Especially you with you're trying to drive.
Yeah. I'm obviously yelling at him because I'm frustrated. And the cat's wandering around and the cat's climbing on my lap and on the dashboard. It was complete chaos. It was complete chaos in the car. Driving from Nova Scotia to Quebec, we also have to pass through New Brunswick. So we have to go through another province, through the way.
So what does that mean as far as the trip? How does that affect things?
Well, that didn't change the distance, but we had to go from Nova Scotia through New Brunswick to Quebec. And this one big stretch of highway through New Brunswick was down to one lane. So, when they do contraflow and they make you switch to the other side of the road. So we were down to one lane on the one side of the road, and the other side was where they were redoing the road. But to the right of us, it was all construction cones. And my dad was making motions like he had to go to the bathroom, but he couldn't verbally say it anymore. He just couldn't, communicate that at this point. There was nowhere for us to pull over. We're in the middle of a construction zone. And so I had to pull off between the cones. I didn't have a choice at this point. So the construction worker on the other side of the road is yelling at us. You can't park there. You can't park there. You have to keep going.
So you pulled off into the construction area rather than just stop in that one lane and block everyone else.
Yeah, I couldn't stay on the road, right? We had to pull off. Didn't have a choice. So, and the construction worker is yelling at us, and my mom is making the motion like my dad's throwing up or something, just trying to hopefully get this construction worker off her back. So she's like, and making these motions like my dad's throwing up, and actually he's got to pee. So she gets him out of the car in the back seat, and she's fiddling with the zipper, get him to go pee. And he is completely taking it the wrong way, thinking she's getting randy with him. So he's being silly.
On the side of the road in a construction area. Right. Okay. He's ready to go anytime.
He's ready to go anytime. Yeah. So, which is amazing at 80. You think, wow, they still think that way, even with dementia. It's crazy. And the car doors are open, and I'm like, I really don't want to see this because I could see everything. My mom just made this comment. I'm not trying to play with your bird. I just started laughing because it was the most ridiculous comment. Did you just call it a bird? Like, really? So anyway.
I had not heard that before.
No,
that's interesting.
Me either. But she ended it took a while, but she finally got him to go pee on the side of the road. And the construction worker's still yelling at us at this point to get out.
Well, at least that was a little bit of success, though. He was able to pee and you could proceed.
Yep. We drove through there. You could tell he was losing his mind at this point. Like, he was just doing weird things, and he was very fidgety in the back seat. And like I said, he kept trying to open the car door and take a seatbelt off. And I'm driving at like 100 kilometers an hour at this point. So, it was scary. And I'm yelling at him to keep closing the door. He's just not understanding or getting anything. He's completely confused as to what's going on. But we finally got to Quebec. It was about 5:30, 6:30-ish at night. We got to Quebec City. And my dad was completely out of it at this point. He was almost uncontrollable. We got our stuff into the room, and we were all hungry at this point. So I remember we went to a restaurant, and of course, French speaking. We're in Quebec. So we're trying to order off the menu, and my dad is just being silly. So we ordered him a Coke, and he had this Coke on the table, and he just kept playing with it and playing with it. And I'm like, Dad, stop playing with it. You're going to knock it over. And he got mad at me because it's almost like you were scolding a child. That's how he would react, like he was getting in trouble all the time. Well, of course, he knocks his drink over all over the table. People at the next table are looking at us, and my dad's basically having a temper tantrum at the table. We managed to get some food down, but my dad had started this thing the summer when we were there. I don't know if he thought it was gravy or what, but he would pour his drink on his plate, on his food. And he was trying to eat his dinner with a straw instead of his fork. And people were staring at us, and people don't understand what's going on. We left the restaurant. My dad was mad, like he was mad. He was yelling and carrying on and making a scene and everything. So we're like, let's just go back to the room and hopefully he'll settle down. We got back to the room. We gave my dad his meds and his pudding. My mom, thinking we were settling down for the night, decided she was going to take her sleeping pill too. And my mom was laying in the bed and she was almost asleep, but my dad just would not settle. He would not settle. He was up and he was down. He was up and he was down. And he went into the bathroom and he tried flushing an entire roll of toilet paper down the toilet, clogged it. It was overflowing everywhere. So I had to call the front desk and they had to come and fix it for us. And I'm just like, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to explain to them like about my dad, and he was just kind of like, he just didn't understand. And I tried to get him to settle down and he wouldn't settle down in bed. And he just kept jumping up and wandering around. And then he would lay down and he would jump up and he would wander around. And it was 9:30 at this point. It's almost like they fight the medication. It's hard to explain, but he would fight it in the end. Like he just would not give in to the medication. Because if any normal person took this trazodone, you would be out cold. And my dad just would not go to sleep. And he was just, we couldn't control him. So I just suggested to my mom, I'm like, look, at this point, let's just pack it up. I'll drive through the night and we'll just get home. I just wanted to get home. I was so tired. I was so worn out. I was so exhausted. I was really upset about my dad. It was a lot.
It sounds, like just sensory overload.
It was,
just overwhelming. The exhaustion and frustration and you still got an 8.5-hour drive to get to your house without even sleeping that night. You're just going to drive through the night.
Yeah, I'd been up since 5:30, that morning. I'm like, let's just drive through the night. I just want to go home.
Are you some kind of superwoman or something? Because, anyone else would be just passed out, exhausted.
I don't even like driving at night, and I have never been up that long, but let alone behind the wheel of a car. It was just so frustrating being in the hotel with him. We couldn't. And I'm like, the neighbors, like people in the next rooms are going to hear us. Like he just was yelling and just carrying on, right? I'm like, we can't stay here. Like we just got to go.
Yeah, regardless of how tired you are, you really had no other choice.
No,
you couldn't.
No,
you couldn't do anything other than let's just see if we can just get home.
We just had to get to where we're going. That's the best we could do. So we packed everything up again and got into the car. This is like 10 p.m. maybe 10:30 when we got back in the car and hit the road again. So we had to drive from Quebec City. We had to drive through Montreal in the middle of the night. My dad, I thought for sure, I'm like, well, maybe he'll settle down in the backseat. Maybe he'll fall asleep back there.
Yeah, he must be exhausted too.
You'd think. No, not at all. He was the opposite. He was wired, completely wired. He would not sleep. He was up all night, the whole night. My mom obviously had taken her sleeping pill, so she fell asleep in the passenger seat, so she was of no use to me. And my dad is in the backseat, literally losing his mind. He was just kept, like I said, he was opening the car doors in the middle of the night and undoing his seatbelt and pouring drinks all over himself. And he was rooting through my purse that I had kind of stuffed beside me. He was rooting through my purse, taking everything out. He had a shaving bag, I guess he'd found in their stuff in the back seat somewhere, like a turquoisey color shaving bag. And it had like toiletries and stuff in it. And he had taken everything out of it and he put it on his foot thinking it was a shoe. So he had this blue shaving bag on his foot like it was a shoe. And he had a towel over his head. I got pictures of these, because I thought nobody would ever believe me. I'm like, I got to get some of these pictures thinking hopefully people will believe me and stuff. So I do have a picture of him with a little towel on his head. And you could see he's fiddling with the shaving bag that he had on his foot. This just went on all night long. My mom's out cold in the passenger seat and I'm yelling at my dad to close the door, to stop opening the door. You're going to let the cat out. And
right. Yeah. The cat could jump out the door or out the window.
Yeah. And he's poking me in the back of the head and everything while I'm driving. Like he's just out of it.
I'm thinking that this has to be so frustrating just trying to get home, but it's got to be so sad for you to see your dad like this.
Yeah, it was hard. I literally watched my dad have a mental breakdown from Newfoundland to Ontario in the backseat of the car. It's one of the most traumatizing things I've experienced. I haven't talked about it a lot in the last 3 years. It's very sad seeing somebody you love so much disappear in front of your face.
That's what dementia does.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's horrible. So we were driving and we got this carried on all night, like I said, and we kind of got to Ontario at dawn-ish. And I don't know if you've ever been to Toronto or whatever, but Toronto has the Highway 401, and it's one of the biggest in North America, or Canada maybe. But it's one of the busiest. It goes all the way across Canada. You can take it from one side to the other. And it's also known as the Trans-Canada Highway. But when you're going through Toronto, you're kind of going through the gauntlet of the busy area. So there's nowhere to pull over at all, because you got collector's lanes, you got the express lanes. And of course, I was in the express lane. So all you have is concrete barriers on either side of you. And even at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's busy. My mom had kind of waken up at this point, and my dad was saying he had to go to the bathroom, but there was nowhere for me to pull over. Like, there was nowhere. I could not pull over at all. So he ended up peeing in his pants. His pants were already soaked to this point with drinks and coffee and pop, and then he peed in his pants. So my mom is kind of leaning over the seat in between the two seats, trying to get my dad's pants off him while I'm driving on the highway in Toronto. So she managed to get his pants off, and we had a blanket back there. So she tried to wrap the blanket around his waist to kind of cover him up, because he had no underwear on either. So here's my dad sitting in the back seat with this blanket wrapped around him, a towel on his head, and a shaving bag on his foot, like a shoe. This is where I made the decision that I had to take my dad to the hospital. There was no way he could come home in this condition, because he was just completely out of his mind.
How close were you at this point to being home?
Toronto to Georgetown is about a 40-minute drive, depending on traffic. That time in the morning, it wasn't too bad. So I think we made it to Georgetown Hospital in like 45 minutes. I pulled up at the emergency in Georgetown, and my mom got my dad out of the backseat of the car, and he had this brown blanket wrapped around his waist, this shaving bag on his foot like a shoe, and I got a picture of my mom walking my dad into the hospital, and he had no idea what was going on at all. I kind of just had a moment of pause for a minute, because I was so tired and so exhausted of everything that I'd experienced in the car. I had to call Dave and tell him what was happening, and I was just bawling on the phone, just bawling. I was so tired, and I was so upset. Luckily, I only had a 15-minute drive. So it was only a 15-minute drive from the hospital to my house in Acton. And I got home, and I pulled up on front of my house on the street, and I just kind of sat there. And Dave, sorry, it's very emotional. Dave came out and greeted me, and I was just oh my God, I was so upset. I just literally crumpled in his arms. It was so hard and upsetting, and I was so sad. I was just so tired. I was so tired. That's just not something you think you're ever going to experience, is watching that happen to somebody right in front of your face. And I mean, the whole point was I just wanted to get to where we were going. Dad didn't really make it to my house.
At least he's at the hospital. He's going to get taken care of. That was the point.
Yeah, I could not bring him to my house in his state. There was no way. You just could not control him at all. He was just completely out of it. And so they sedated him at the hospital, an emergency being emergency. We're like, well, we can't keep him. There's nothing we can do for him. And so they called us, and we had to go pick him up. And he was heavily sedated. So here we are. We had to go pick him up, and Dave was with me this time, and we had to get him into the car, and it was complete dead weight. And he's still not sleeping. He's still awake. Just refused to sleep. My dad would not sleep. It's crazy. So Dave my husband is a big guy. So Dave managed to get him into the car and he was in the back seat. We drove to Acton and we had to stop at the drugstore for my mom to run in and pick up medications for herself and for my dad. So I was in the passenger seat and Dave was in the driver's seat and my mom had been sitting in the back seat with my dad. So my dad was still in the back seat when my mom ran in the store. I don't know what my dad was thinking. For whatever reason, he just did this big hork and spit on me and Dave from the back seat. Just spit all over us. And we were like really taken aback. And that is not something my dad would do ever in his right mind. He would have been mortified, absolutely mortified if he knew he had done this. It was like all over us and we're covered in my dad's spit. We managed to get him home to my house, and our house, you have to climb like 10 steps to get up to our front door. So Dave was trying to get my dad up. We managed to get my dad into the spare room, which was on the main level. My dad had been there for a couple of minutes, and then we're like, well, maybe he should go to the bathroom. So Dave and my mom tried to get my dad on the toilet to go pee. He was not budging. He was squatting over and he was tensing every muscle in his body. He just would not give in. He was refusing 100%. And again, he thought my mom was trying to play with him, right? Like, this is where his mind kept going. And
well, he is a man. So, I mean,
yeah, like, yeah, I know. So she kind of kept batting his hand away because he kept trying to put her hand down there. And Dave is like, oh my God, right? He didn't know what to do at this point. So we just brought him back into the room and we laid him down on the bed, hoping he would just kind of lay down and chill out and have a sleep because we didn't know what else to do with him at this point. And we kind of closed the door. And a few minutes later, we heard a bang from inside that room. And he had tried to stand up on his own and had fallen down because he was so heavily sedated. But he had fallen down right in front of the bedroom door. So we couldn't even get the bedroom door open.
So he had it blocked by his own weight from the inside.
He had it, yeah. He was just laying down out of it on the floor, could not stand up. We're like, well, we can't keep him here. Like, this is insane. Like, why would they send him home in this state? There was nothing we could do with him. So we're like, we have to call 911 and they have to come get him. So I asked my husband this question the other day, Dave, and I said, who called 911 that day for my dad? Because I could not remember if it was me, if it was Dave, or if it was my mom or my daughter. I could not remember. He says, I think it was you, but I do not remember making that phone call. But apparently it was me. And that's just it's something I blocked out. I can't remember it.
Yeah, after all you had been through for this whole past few days and lack of sleep and everything, it's not surprising you would not remember a phone call.
No, because I still hadn't slept at this point. I was still awake. Yeah, Dave says, you called, but I don't remember calling.
So they show up.
We managed to get the door open and the EMS helped us get my dad on the bed, but he was just kind of out of control, resisting and stuff. So they had to put my dad in a wheelchair and they had to put a restraining jacket on him to get him out and to take him to the hospital because we were afraid he was going to hit somebody. That's how out of control he was. And my dad was not a violent man in any way, shape, or form. My dad was a very gentle, loving man.
You know, at this point, you really have to think this person, he's your dad, but he's not really your dad anymore.
No.
I mean,
no.
It's not who he was when he's like that.
No. So they ended up taking him back to the hospital and we refused to bring him home because we're like, we cannot take care of him. There's no way we can take care of him. So the doctor is basically saying, the doctor was mad at us because we wanted to keep him there. The doctor was literally getting mad at us. And we're like, well, how are we supposed to take care of him? We can't take care of him. He needs care. Like, he needs full-time care.
Was the hospital saying that they couldn't provide the care that he needs?
At this point, I think they just thought of it more of as a burden and that he didn't really need to be there. But after I explained the story to them of the drive and where he come from and what had happened to him, they kind of relented and kept him at this point. So they kept him in the hospital care for a few weeks and tried different meds to try and get him stabilized. He was kind of out of it for about a week or so. He slept most of the time. So they kept him there for 3 weeks and then they moved him over to the CTC side, which is called continuing transitional care. So I call it purgatory because you're kind of in limbo. You're not really in the hospital, but you're not anywhere else either.
So it's more of a long-term kind of thing?
No, it's a temporary until they could find him a long-term home.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, he was in limbo land for about 8 months. They kept him there because they just had no long-term care available. Because we wanted something that was kind of close to us. Finally, something opened up in Guelph after 8 months. So in May of 2022, he moved into St. Joseph's long-term care facility in Guelph. He had to go into the behavioral unit because of his outbursts, and he got handsy and stuff like that. It's just like a hospital floor with nothing out. He was there for a year. And it's funny because he always knew who I was, and he always knew who my mom was, but he didn't know anybody else. He didn't know my husband. He didn't know my daughters. He didn't know his other grandchildren, my niece and nephew. He didn't know who anybody was. He didn't recognize anybody except me and my mom. He would always smile when I would come in and see him, but it was hard. It was hard to go see him.
What made those visits difficult? Anything specifically? I mean, you could see that he wasn't himself, obviously.
He was always happy to see me or my mom, but he would walk around a lot, and they had a tendency to kind of walk into everybody else's room. They all thought everybody's room was their room.
Well, they all kind of look the same, sort of, right?
They do, but yeah, they would all just walk into each other's rooms and take everybody else's stuff. So my dad had this little orange and white cat that looked just like his cat, and he thought it was his cat, but it wasn't a real cat, obviously. But
Oh, it was a stuffed animal. Okay.
yeah, but it was kind of like, it looked like it was sleeping laying down, and it was kind of hard to the touch, but it had soft fur, but my dad thought it was his cat. So that kind of kept him happy. But yeah, he would wander around, and then we'd say, Dad, don't go in that room. That's not your room. And he would get mad. So then I'd say, okay, well, if you're going to be like this, I'm just going to go home then, right? And he would get mad that I'm leaving. So it was a vicious cycle all the time of having to see my dad. And there was one time he got really mad when I left, and their doors were locked. He couldn't get out of the ward. So he had to use a code to get out. And he was mad that I was leaving. And he actually put his hands on me and was grabbing me and was screaming in my face, saying, I'm going to kill you. I'll kill you. And that's not my dad at all. And my husband, Dave, had to get in between us both to kind of protect me so I could edge out the door. And as we got on the other side of the door, he was banging on the window, still screaming at us. It was just heartbreaking every time I had to go see him. It was so hard. It was so hard, you know. And he was there for exactly a year, and he passed away May 11th of 2023. He just stopped eating and stopped drinking. His body just said no more. His mind just forgot how to do things. Couldn't even do the basics anymore. It was a blessing, you know. I wouldn't want anybody to live like that, and I know he wouldn't have wanted to live like that, so.
Right, but it's kind of an interesting situation. He's not on life support where you could make the decision to turn that off.
Mm-hmm.
He's just misbehaving a lot. And not really knowing what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you feel guilty for having them make that traumatic trip with you. Where does that guilt come from? You were doing your best, what you thought was the best for them.
I was, and I thought it would be best for them to come here. But I also think, on the other hand, maybe if I didn't make that long trip with my dad, he may not have gotten the way he was to that level. I mean, obviously it was inevitable. He had dementia. You can only live with that for so long before your brain starts to shut down. But I sometimes feel guilty that I pushed him into it by bringing them here. You know, was I being selfish in bringing him here because I wanted to see my dad before he got really bad? My kids wanted to see him. You know, my niece and nephew wanted to see him. On the other hand, I think maybe he would have been better off in Newfoundland. I don't know. It's one of those I wish scenarios.
But you can only make a decision based on the information you have at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you were thinking that that was the best thing.
Mm-hmm.
How's your mom doing now?
My mom still lives in the apartment in our basement. We've had a lot of things happen. It's not easy being an adult living with a parent. We've had a lot of issues, and we currently do not have a relationship, even though she lives in my house. It's been tough. I've actually had therapy over it. It's been tough. I lost my dad and my mom all in the same year, essentially, both different ways. Along with dealing with my dad, I was dealing with his other sister, my aunt and uncle. They lived up north. They'd never had kids. So I was their power of attorney. So they were failing in health. So I was also taking care of them at the same time as my dad was in the hospital and trying to go see him. So that year was a bad year. I ended up losing all three of them in 6 months. As far as my mom, I don't know what the future holds. I don't completely close that door, but there's also been a lot of things that I don't know that are fixable. It's a tough call. It's a very tough call.
It sounds like that could be a whole other conversation.
It is. It's a whole other story. It's crazy. But yeah,
What's your advice for anyone dealing with a loved one who has dementia?
First off, don't argue with them because it's like you're fighting with a 5-year-old. Literally, it's like you're arguing with somebody who doesn't understand. So as frustrating as it can be, and yes, you can lose your patience. It's very easy to get frustrated and not have the patience to deal with somebody in that situation. Just take it one day at a time and enjoy what time you do have with them, because you literally watch them vanish before your eyes and there's nothing you can do.
What's your favorite memory with your dad?
I don't have just one. I love my dad so much and I miss him a lot. I just remember him taking me fishing as a kid and cuddling with him in his chair. And my last best memory of my dad is 6 months before he passed away in the nursing home. Me and my husband were visiting him and we were about to leave. And I'm like, oh, I forgot my purse in your room. Oh, I have to go get my purse. So Dave stayed with my dad and I started to walk away from my dad and he yelled out my name. He's like, Kari. And that's the first time he said my name in years, anybody's name. And it was just one of those like moments like, oh my God, my dad just said my name, right? And it was just one of those heartfelt moments that is just one of those lasting things with me. And, and I know it was probably just a memory, like almost like muscle memory. It just clicked into his mind because I was walking away from him. But it's just that special moment in a time where there weren't any anymore.
A little glimpse of him as he was before, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. He was a good man. Just cherish what you have and just try to remember them for who they were and not who they are at the point of what you're going through it. Because you do tend to get lost in their illness as well. It's not just hard on them, it's hard on everybody. And as a child, watching your parent disappear year by year it's a hard thing, but you just got to keep them alive and remember who they were.
Kari told me that she's taken advantage of having therapy over the past few years to help her process what happened on that trip and afterward. You can see pictures of Kari and her parents in the episode notes at whatwasthatlike.com/204. And she's also in the Facebook group, so if there's something you want to ask her that I didn't think of, or if you just want to comment on the story you just heard, you can do that there. Just look for the post with this episode title, Kari's Dad Had a Dementia Breakdown, in the podcast Facebook group at whatwasthatlike.com/Facebook. And if you're in that group, you know the current question that we posted that everyone is answering now is this: what did your boss do that made him or her the worst boss ever? So if you have a terrible boss story, come on over to the group and tell us about it. Also going to play this voicemail that came in, and this one is kind of interesting. Most of the time voicemails are like, yeah, I just listened to this episode and I wanted to say, a comment or something. This person listens to the show, but just wanted to remind everyone to be aware of child predators.
Hi, Scott. My name's Lexi. Just recently, I found out that my high school history teacher was arrested for having 14 counts of child pornography. And I was just calling in because when I was in high school, I was in his class, and he was the coolest teacher. He was very chill. very nice. He didn't come off in that way at all. He was also targeting boys, so I didn't really get that side of him. But he was just a really good teacher. So it's just extremely shocking to find out that he was doing those things and all of that. By the way, his name is Drake Sherman. I am totally fine with putting him on blast because I think that child predators do not deserve any sort of protection. But yeah, just to everyone out there, be aware, stay alert of your surroundings and the people that teach your children. Just beware. It's crazy, but have a good one. I love the podcast.
So yeah, you can call in and say something about the podcast or anything else you think might be useful or entertaining. The podcast voicemail line is open 24/7 and it's never answered by a human. So you can call anytime you want. That number is 727-386-9468. And I also want to give a big shout out to a specific listener, Janet. She actually listens to the podcast on the website, which is not something that's very common. But because that's where she listens to the show, she was able to discover some problems with the website audio files, and she let me know about it so that I could get it resolved. So thanks very much, Janet. I appreciate it. Graphics for this episode were created by Bob Bretz. Full episode transcription was created by James Lai. And now we're about to hear this week's listener story. This is what comes at the end of every episode. An audio story around 5 to 10 minutes long, sent in by a listener just like you. We'd love to hear a story from you. Just record it on your phone and email it to me, scott@whatwasthatlike.com. This week's story is about a scary situation with a tornado. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.
December 9th, 2023 started out like any normal Saturday for my family. We all had various plans, but the weather was mild and it was overall just a nice morning. It was getting close to Christmas, so I had ordered some Christmas cards from Walgreens. My husband had work at the post office, and my oldest was headed to Greenville, Kentucky with his girlfriend for a go-kart race. My plan for the day was to pick up the Christmas cards, go to a Red Cross blood drive, and then drop my youngest off at a sleepover. He begged me to let him stay home while I ran my errands and then take him, but I just didn't want to leave him home all alone. We left the house around 11 a.m. and headed to Walgreens. We chatted a little bit on the way while listening to the radio. As we pulled into the parking lot to pick up the Christmas cards, a weather update came over the radio. They said that the forecast called for some storms in the afternoon. They said there was a chance for heavy rain, some wind, and that they couldn't rule out an isolated tornado. My son asked, "Mom, what's an isolated tornado?" I told him it was really nothing to worry about, just a random small tornado that could come up in a field or something, but that didn't last long and wouldn't really cause any damage. Boy, was I wrong. We picked up the cards and talked about how good they turned out as we drove to Charlotte, Tennessee for the blood drive. Anytime we go to Charlotte, which is about a 45-minute drive with light traffic, we make sure to stop at Sweet Charlotte, a cute little soda shop, for lunch. So after I donated my pint of blood, we headed there. As we were finishing our lunch, I got an alert that a tornado was spotted in Indian Mound, heading in the direction of Clarksville, where we live. My husband is a mail carrier, and I knew he'd likely be delivering mail in packages, so I called him to give the heads up to be careful and to find somewhere safe to take cover if needed. I was shocked when he answered the phone, and he told me that the tornado was there, and they were running for the storm shelter inside the post office. I thought surely it wasn't actually hitting the post office. He said he had to go and that he'd call me back. Trying not to panic and scare my son, I offered to stop at the little country market down the street from where we were. It wasn't even raining where we were, so I thought it best to hang tight for a few minutes and make sure the weather cleared. Then I got a text from my oldest, the one who had gone to the go-kart race in Greenville. Greenville is about an hour from home in the opposite direction, so almost 2 hours from where I was at the time. His text said, "Mom, they're saying there are funnel clouds over the arena and we are hiding under the bleachers." At this point, panic set in. I quickly got myself and my youngest in the car and we headed toward home. I called my oldest, and he said they were okay for the moment, just hiding under the bleachers, and he'd keep me updated. So then I called my husband to check on him. It kept going to voicemail. My youngest got scared and thought we'd get hit by the tornado, so I kept trying to keep him calm and stay calm myself. I called my sister, and she tried to help me to call my husband. Neither of us could get through. Finally, about 20 minutes later, I got a text from my oldest that they were given the all clear where he was and that he was okay. That was a huge relief. Still about 30 minutes from home, I kept trying to call my husband. Still nothing. I kept calling, kept going to voicemail. I called my sister in tears, begging her to tell me he was okay. She said that likely he's fine and the cell towers are probably just jammed, which made some sense. She stayed on the phone with me as I got a bit closer to Clarksville. The sky seemed to clear up a bit, which helped to calm my son. As we got into Clarksville, I tried to call my husband again. Still nothing. I was on the phone with my sister as emergency vehicles went flying past me in the direction of home and the post office. Side note, we live less than 5 minutes from the post office, so I was heading towards both. I tried to call my husband again, and again it went to voicemail. My sister tried to reassure me that the cell towers were probably just knocked down. Then it hit me that I was still on the phone with her, and I was only about 8 minutes away at that point. She and I both started crying. I got to the light before the light at the post office. My light was top of the hill, post office was the bottom, so you could see it. And I could see emergency vehicles everywhere. I told my sister I had to go, and then I lost it. I was so scared that I had just lost my husband. Reminding myself that my son was in the car, I tried to wipe my tears away, and I said, let's go home and make sure the dogs are okay. I didn't even think about how our neighborhood had fared. As I went to pull into the neighborhood, there were emergency vehicles all over. We couldn't get to our house. Panic returned for both my son and I. We couldn't get home because of all the vehicles blocking the streets and power lines and trees down. That's when I decided to carefully turn around and take one of the unblocked back streets back towards the post office. There was a back entrance to the Sonic on that street, and the intersection for the post office was just diagonal from there. I pulled into the Sonic and I parked my car. I told my son to stay there and that I would be right back. I wasn't thinking quite straight. But I told him I was going to walk across to the post office and get Dad, and I'd be back. As I started to open the door, my phone chimed. It was a text from my husband. He said, I'm okay. Post office hit. My truck is damaged, but I am okay. Call's not going through. Love you. At that moment, I could finally breathe. I slowly made it back into our neighborhood, half of which was destroyed, but by the grace of God, our street and our house was safe. We didn't have power, but we didn't care. We spent the next days helping folks in our neighborhood who had lost their homes in the unexpected EF3 tornado that hit Clarksville on December 9th. I'll never forget how scared I was, nor how lucky I am to have my husband and my kids safe at home with me.